All right, so at this point, you should have already watched two other videos before this one. First one is the Compromise to Crisis video part one, which starts with the Missouri Compromise of 1820 and ends with the caning of Charles Sumner. You should have then watched the caning of Charles Sumner separate video done by Hip Hughes, where he goes into quite a bit of detail and a little bit of backstory, and then the detail what happens, and then sort of what happens post caning there with Mr. Charles Sumner and others. If you have all that set, then we're going to move on to part two of Compromise to Crisis. So we're going to go back to Kansas. Now we're in 1858, and two constitutions are written for the hopeful state here. So first you have the Lecompton Constitution, which was written to have Kansas be a slave state, and then you have the Topeka Constitution, which was written for Kansas to be a free state. So again, these are your two groups. You have the slavery group, also known as Border Ruffians, and then you have your anti-slavery group, which is also known as the Free Soilers. Now, President Buchanan at the time actually supported the Lecompton Constitution, and he actually tries to bring Kansas in as a slave state in 1858. But remember, because of the Compromise of 1850, you have an imbalance in the Senate of more free than slaves. So that's going to be a really difficult thing to get done. So this creates all kinds of controversy in Congress. Or I say creates it, it really just makes it worse. More fighting, and Kansas is still not made a state. So you have all this going on from the political side. Again, you still have this abolitionist movement that's pushing on things. You have things like that have happened in the last couple decades, everything from Uncle Tom's Cabin to the speeches and stories of Frederick Douglass. You have abolitionist newspapers like the Liberator. All of these things are just creating this tension and everything in the country. Next up, we have the Dred Scott decision. All right, now this is, I say next, it's really about the same time period. It was an 1857 decision. So all this is just simmering, right? So the question is, who is Dred Scott, first of all? Dred Scott was a slave who traveled with his master into the North several times. Now, what this means, though, is he was able to do some things, like he legally got married and had children, right? And also, under the law, with him being in those free states, I forget the exact time periods, but he was there long enough to where by law he should have been free, particularly at his master's death. Okay? So, let's see what happens. Now, Dred Scott sued for his freedom after his master died. And by sued, it basically means he goes to court. And his argument was actually quite simple. He argued that living on free soil made him free. And he was not the first slave to make this argument. In fact, many slaves had received their freedom based on this exact same argument. So, this eventually will find its way to the Supreme Court. Okay? And in one of the worst decisions ever made, it was wrong on every conceivable level. It's wrong on a legal level. It's wrong on a moral level. It's just wrong. There's nothing right about this decision. They ruled against him. So they said two things, okay? And I'm actually going to deal with the second one here first, where it said he had no standing. So standing is a legal term and concept where it means that you don't have the right, or there's no legal basis for you to be filing the lawsuit, okay? And so what they said here was that, well, since technically he was property and not a citizen, he couldn't file a lawsuit. So they would just toss it out on that, because if you're not standing, then lawsuits get tossed out. But the court didn't stop there, which they could have. They would have been wrong because they had their own legal precedents saying, going against this, but they could have stopped there and thrown the case out and moved on. But that's not what happened anywhere remotely close, actually, what happened. They had to take it a step further and then went on to say that Scott had, quote, no rights which the white man was bound to respect. In essence, because Dred Scott was a black man. It wouldn't matter if he had the right to sue or if he had the right to be free. Because of his race, no white man had to pay attention to that, which was completely wrong and false and morally just abhorrent and terrible. And then with all of that, they continued even more. And they ruled that the Missouri Compromise itself was unconstitutional because they said Congress could not restrict slavery. And so they went back. So there's three things here, right? First of all, they said he had no standing because technically he's property. Then they said even if he did have standing, he had no rights that any white man would actually have to listen to. And then on top of that, they said, well, you know what? Look, actually, we're going to go ahead and toss out the rest of the Missouri Compromise while we're at it. So this is an absolutely terrible decision, and it splits the country in ways that many other things had not. And in fact, it will lead to this thing called the Lincoln-Douglas Debates. All right, so next up we have the Lincoln-Douglas Debates. And so a lot of people assume or think that these debates happen during a presidential election. And it's not true, actually. They happen during as a part of an 1850s version of a campaign for U.S. Senate. Things were a little different then, but bottom line, this is what they were doing. Now, the reason people get confused is that Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas would also be up for the presidency in 1860. All right, so the debates were between Abraham Lincoln, who was with the Republican Party. During the debates, he made his one of his more famous speeches, not his most famous, but one of his more famous speeches in the House Divided speech, where he says, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." And he goes on to say, "I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free." And then he basically says that it will either become one or the other. And this is in 1858, so this is in the same tumultuous time period right before the outbreak of the Civil War. And if you take a look here on the map, you see that these are towns and places all over the state of Illinois, everything from Freeport to the north, Jonesboro on the south, Quincy to the west, and sort of the east is Charleston. And so that is the Lincoln-Douglas debates. Now, during these debates, Stephen Douglas ends up stating what is now known as the Freeport Doctrine. So this came about because Abraham Lincoln was challenging Douglas on the Dred Scott decision. Now, these two, much of their debates revolved around the issue of slavery and how, well, really debate in the rest of the country. You know, how do you handle slavery? New states come along, things of this nature. And so in an effort to sort of split the difference between not appearing to be too pro-slavery or too anti-slavery, Stephen Douglas comes up with this idea, and he says territories can vote against having slavery. Well, this really angers many of his Southern Democratic supporters because they are pro-slavery, and the idea that they could vote against it, it really angers them that he would even go there, that he would even give a hint that he was in any way anti-slavery. Now, Lincoln, to his credit, was clearly anti-slavery. Now, he's not an abolitionist per se at this point, meaning he wanted to get rid of it in places where it was, but he definitely had some heavy anti-slavery views. Now, Douglas will end up winning this election for Senate. However, Lincoln really is the big winner in this, in that he gains a lot of national notoriety because of this. A lot of the national newspapers and such would cover the debates. And this is really one of the big things that propels Lincoln to being the Republican nominee for president in the 1860 presidential election. Now, mentioned before that we would get back to our buddy John Brown. So in 1859, John Brown has moved from Kansas and is now, he's plotting in Virginia. Now, the plan that he comes up with for the 1859 Harpers Ferry raid really begins with the Dred Scott decision. So for about a year, John Brown plans his actions here. The idea was that he would attack the U.S. arsenal, where they had all their guns and ammo for the United States military at Harpers Ferry, Virginia. And once he got these supplies, that he would give them to the slaves. As the slaves would rise up in revolt, he would have basically a small army to go and basically start taking on Virginia and trying to get rid of slavery. However, unfortunately for John Brown, the slaves never rose up in revolt. Now, eventually, U.S. military, led by Robert E. Lee, and local militias and townspeople would lead to the capture of John Brown and his followers, many of whom were his actual sons were with him as well. Now, Brown and his followers were tried for murder and treason against Virginia, to be noted here, and he was sentenced to death. Okay, so it was not the worst plan in the world, but he lost the element of surprise through a series of really unfortunate events for John Brown. But to be honest, John Brown was definitely a radical and a bit on the crazy side of things. Now, your perspective of John Brown is really dependent on what side of slavery you're on at the time. Now, he was executed in December of 1859, and Northerners will end up viewing him as a hero because he is fighting the good fight. He is literally giving up his life in an effort to end slavery. Southerners, on the other hand, they saw this very much as an attack to the institution of slavery, and Southerners could not conceive of a way of holding on to their way of life without holding on to slavery. Everything from economics to social status to everything was dependent and linked to the agriculture and thus also to slavery. And so when you attack slavery, it's more for the Southerners. It was more than just attacking slavery. It was attacking their very way of life, the very fundamental aspects of their daily lives. And so they would see, obviously, John Brown very, very differently. Northerners, on the other hand, definitely have the moral high ground when it comes to slavery, and they see that how terrible it is, and it needs to be eliminated. Now, other interesting thing here is that as John Brown is waiting for execution, he ends up doing a number of different writings, almost like letters or journal entries, and one of which he hands to a guard on the way out. And in this particular writing, he says essentially that he's now fully convinced that the only way to get rid of slavery in the country is through the shedding of blood. Now, this is in December of 1859, and within a year, South Carolina would have seceded from the Union, and within approximately 18 months, war would have broken out. So it was somewhat prophetic, maybe. All right, now this gets us to the election of 1860. Okay, so this is a very consequential election. So let's take a look at the candidates. You actually have 4 different candidates in this election, which for us would be unheard of. I mean, we have multiple candidates, but these are 4 main national candidates. All right, now, of course, you have Abraham Lincoln, who is the Republican nominee. You have Stephen Douglas, who had the support of Northern Democrats. You have John Breckinridge, who is the support of Southern Democrats. And then you have John Bell, the Constitutional Union Party representative. And these 4 men would be the names on the presidential side of the ballot. So, the results. Basically, it's really like there were 2 elections, one in the North and one in the South. And I say that because in many southern states, Abraham Lincoln's name was not even on the ballot. Okay, and it's very obvious if you take a look at the results here of this map that you had Lincoln dominating the North, and then the two states out west. You had Stephen Douglas get one state there in Missouri, but he got a lot of popular vote, but not as much as Lincoln in these northern states, and so because of that, he has virtually no electoral votes. You have the Union Party, who they did a lot more with a lot of those states that are right in between the North and South. And so at the end of the day, this election is about Lincoln winning, but also South Carolina's response. And South Carolina in December of 1860 states that they are no longer a part of the United States. They are doing what's called seceding. And they are truly the beginning of the Exodus. So the Southern Secession has begun with South Carolina on December 20th, 1860. They would be followed in January 9th, 1861 by Mississippi. The next day, Florida. The next day after that, Alabama. 8 days later, Georgia will secede. Then you have Louisiana 1 week later. Then Texas on February 1st, 1861. And then you have, in order would be Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee. And so here you can see, so that by June 8, 1861, there are now 11 states who have seceded from the Union. Interesting on this map, though, we had some border slave states, places like Missouri, Kentucky, eventually West Virginia, Maryland, Delaware. They continue to have slavery, but they do not leave the Union. All right, so this is the part 2 video, and so that should wrap up your notes. Definitely if you missed anything, please make sure and go back and get them.